I returned to Biomutant after about a year. When I played it for the first time, I was a little unimpressed. It was trying to be so many different things and not doing any one thing particularly well. I played it for about 15 hours just to get a good grasp of the game, see what it was, and then I felt like I was done. But then it sat in my backlog, just staring at me every time that I opened Steam, and I figured at this point, what the heck, I've already invested so much time into it, I might as well finish it. So I came back to it, loaded up my old save, and just set about finishing the game, experiencing everything it had to offer. And I found that there are a lot of things that I didn't enjoy about the game, true to my first play experience, but there was a few things to appreciate about the game as well that made it worth finishing. One thing that I wasn't really able to appreciate, unfortunately, was the story. To me, it was a massive, weird mess that didn't make a lot of sense, was very contrived, and I just didn't really enjoy or become invested at all. The game is narrated by a character with a very soothing voice that does try to get you invested in the story, but while he was very good at his job, he couldn't make up for the shortfalls of the story for me, and I just could not get into it at all. So I ended up skipping through a lot of the cutscenes at the end, just focusing on the overall gameplay. And the gameplay does have merit. The combat is pretty good. I found myself getting into it and really enjoying the combat encounters in the game, which is good because that's like 95% of the game outside of open world exploration and looting, which I will happily say is quite good as well. It is fun to run around, explore locations, and to loot them for gear. Although, once you've progressed in the game a decent chunk, most of the loot you pick up is pretty useless, and I'm saying this after I invested a lot of points into my luck stat just to try and game the system and get good gear. Most of the stuff I was picking up wasn't really any better than the stuff that I was using by the time I got towards the final chapters of the game. And I ended up just wearing a lot of the same stuff for most of my playthrough once I found some good gear. The world is interesting and varied. It's a different world than other games. There isn't really anything that I've played that's very similar, which is quite good. It does mean that it is quite memorable. The music is actually really good. I found myself enjoying a lot of the tracks in the game. The game has a lot more vehicle sections than I actually expected. There is a lot more vehicular combat than I thought there would be. And unlike most games that try to do vehicle combat and vehicle gameplay, Biomutants is actually quite fun. You get to find cosmetic parts out in the world to upgrade your vehicles. The vehicles all operate differently and feel different, and they're quite fun to use in combat. And the boss fights aren't revolutionary in any way. They are pretty good. They're a decent time because they pair so well with the vehicle combat. As for negatives about the game, while the open world is interesting, it does become a bit boring to explore after the first couple of hours. Like I said, the looting is fun, but once you're not finding gear that is really helpful in any way, exploring just becomes a bit of a chore. The open world is quite massive, and while you do get a mount to help you traverse the world, it does start to get very samey, which is a trap that a lot of open world games do fall into. The side missions I found were very boring and very similar throughout the entire game. A lot of the time in open world games, side missions are like the redeeming factor of the game if the story isn't good, but in this game, the side missions were just so boring, with so many of them being very, very similar. Go here, kill these things, retrieve this. Go here, kill this, retrieve that. It was very similar and felt like I was doing the exact same side mission for the entire game. I didn't end up finishing a lot of the side missions just because once I've played through like 30 of the same side mission, it felt like I was doing the exact same thing over and over, and I was losing my mind, so I figured there's no good rewards for this, I'll just skip them. Unfortunately, while the combat is fun, none of the weapons that I ended up finding or using in my build ended up feeling really overpowered. I never got to a state where I felt like I could just demolish the battlefield with this overpowered gear, which is a shame for an RPG, because the best part about an RPG is the grind up until you get powerful and then being able to demolish everything with the gear that you've grinded for. The dialogue in this game goes on and on and on. This game unfortunately does not know when to shut up. The narrator is good, like I mentioned before, but when he is narrating lines that just you do not need, the game does not need like 16 paragraphs to describe the end of one side mission. I ended up just skipping through a lot of the dialogue because it was just so unnecessary. And while I won't spoil it in case you do want to experience this fever dream for yourself, the ending to the game, the ending to the story was very weird and kind of nonsense. It wasn't satisfying in any way, and I just felt like, okay, the game's over. Overall, A Fever Dream is how I would describe this game and my entire experience playing it. It's a very weird, wacky, and overly long open world action RPG. It has a few unique elements that make it a unique experience, and if you really want to play it, there are some redeeming factors, but as an overall game, I found it to be very repetitive and not in a good way. Mass Effect Andromeda is a weird game for me. I got the game for free from Nvidia way back in the day when it launched as a bonus with my graphics card. It's definitely not a game that I jumped on the hate wagon for. There was a massive amount of hate for the way that the game presented itself and how different it was from the original trilogy, and a lot of other factors that people generally find to be mad with something new. The game is responsible for one of my favorite moments in gaming that is cemented in my mind as an oh shit moment. Something that I'll just remember forever as a moment in gaming that really wowed me. Going down into the first Remnant Vault for the first time, it blew my teenage mind with how great it looked. Like, I had played some good looking games before that, but this one just kind of floored me with the scale and scope of what was presented in front of me. And replaying the game now, so many years later, I still get that feeling looking out into the massive underground vaults that the game has on display for the first time. Every other time after that kind of cheapened that experience a little bit because every vault in the game feels very similar and they all look kind of the same. Nothing will ever take away that first moment of staring out at the massive underground cavern and going, oh shit, that's all out there. Just something about the way that it doesn't look fake in any way really stood out to me as a teenager. Anyway, Mass Effect Andromeda is a pretty good game with a lot of elements that fall short to the previous entries in the series. Because Mass Effect Andromeda is such a large game, I figured I would break it down into sections and talk about what I like and dislike about the game in that way to keep it clear and concise. Because otherwise I feel like this part of the video could end up very rambling and long and very unfocused. I'm going to start with the story and quests because I think the story setup is very unique and interesting and appeals to me personally, even though I'm not a huge fan of sci-fi. Sci-fi has to have a really interesting story to really grip me. And Mass Effect Andromeda has that, setting out from your home world 700 years ago to arrive in a new galaxy to colonize it is an interesting premise to me. It really is all about adventure, and the game does set that up in the beginning to be a big payoff. Unfortunately, I do feel like they fumble it quite hard because the game tries to be more action than the exciting idea of developing worlds. It goes into a whole good versus evil plot that I wasn't really invested in when all I wanted to do was be playing a Mass Effect game about settling worlds and diplomacy with aliens and creating settlements and solving problems for people on these worlds that we discover. And there is some of that in the game, but a lot of it is overshadowed by very repetitive quests and very drawn out story missions. And the story missions that I did find interesting are very short and drawn out over a very long campaign that is very unfocused. They have an entire new faction in the game for a villain, while their faction is basically all you fight throughout the entire game, aside from a few other small factions to pad it out for variety's sake. The main villain is barely in the game. He's in the game for maybe like 3 or 4 minutes of total overall screen time, and then he's dead by the end of it. He's just there, he exists, he does some bad things, and then you kill him, which for me is not very satisfying at all. The whole good versus evil shtick, while it was fun for the first trilogy and the first 3 games, they built up to it over 3 games, and it had a satisfying conclusion up until the final choice, which is pretty divisive. The whole fighting the villains in the previous game was satisfying. So I'd say in terms of story, I'd say the opening and the start of the story is really interesting, but the rest of the game simply does not live up to the promise of that initial pitch. In terms of gameplay and combat, the gameplay is pretty smooth, but it's very limited. There isn't much variety to mix up the content there, so every mission and everything you do in the game kind of just feels very similar. You're either shooting aliens and killing things, or you're running around scanning things. That's 95% of the entire game. outside of talking to people. The combat starts very slow, with unlockable abilities only really getting good towards the end of the game, so in the start of the game you feel very squishy and very underpowered, and while there is a lot of weapons in the game, a lot of them just feel very similar. There is a severe lack of enemy variety, so like I mentioned before, you kind of just fight the same enemies for the entire game. Gunfights in Hour 5 feel the same as Hour 65. You're fighting the same things, and while you are killing them slightly faster towards the end, you're still kind of doing the same thing in the same ways. The FOV in combat I found to be absolutely horrendous. Like, there is an FOV slider, but if you crank it all the way up outside of combat, it looks horrible, with you like having this really warped fisheye lens, and then at a comfortable distance to me outside of combat was horrible in combat, and there's no real way to change that. So you're stuck with this over-the-shoulder view that is really, really constrictive. I felt that way throughout the entire game, and there's no real way to change it. The armor sets that you get in the game all look terrible, except for like maybe 2. The N7 armor looks amazing, but I don't really want to give Andromeda credit for that because it's looked great in all the games. And there's like maybe one other armor set, the Remnant set, that looks alright, but everything else just looks horrible. And I felt myself not really using it throughout the entire game just because I kind of want to look good, not look like I'm wearing a bunch of alien ball sacks. Gun variety, like I mentioned before, is pretty good. There's a lot of weapons in the game, but there is like no attachment variety. You get like maybe 3 attachments to choose from for each weapon, and that's it. And while those attachments do have rarities, it doesn't do enough to really like make the guns feel different. I found myself using the same attachments on different styles of guns. Like a burstfire assault rifle, you should want a different attachment to a full auto assault rifle. But no, there's kind of just like 3 attachments to choose from, and that's it. So I found myself using the same type of attachments on each weapon throughout the entire game. The jump pack in the game is great. It's honestly one of the most satisfying and best jetpacks I've used in any game. It's just great for traversal, it's great for getting around the world. I found it very satisfying and intuitive to use, and it has just the right amount of gameplay smoothness to make it fun. I'll touch quickly on crafting. Crafting is an element in the game, and while I did find it a bit useful, I found since I didn't invest in crafting early on, it was kind of useless towards the late game because so many of the late game armors and weapons you need such a large amount of materials to use and upgrade. So while I did use a fair amount of crafting, I wasn't able to craft the late game armor to really make it useful just because I didn't invest in it early on. And I will say that the inventory system in the game is terrible. It is horrible sorting through all your gear and all of your attachments and stuff. It is so unintuitive and difficult to use. This game gets no points for its inventory system. As for the port and the performance, the game ran pretty good for me. There was a few areas that caused a lot of random dips, but I was able to kind of like brute force my way through the game on my PC, so I didn't really have too many issues. But in the past, when I played on previous machines, I did find that the game did have some performance issues. The controls are pretty good. There's nothing much I can really complain about in that regard. All remappable, which is good. Alt-tabbing breaks the game's window mode, which I found very frustrating. Every time you alt-tab the game, it goes into windowed mode, and you have to go into the settings and change it from windowed mode back to full screen mode every single time. I alt-tab out of games a lot to reply to people and just to check various things, and this was super annoying over a like 70-hour playthrough just to have it break like 4 or 5 times in a session. And also, the mouse stops working randomly in the menus sometimes, causing you to have to reload a save, which is not the most inconvenient thing, but it's still super annoying. Up next, companions. We have a solid mix of characters here. They all fall back on stereotypes quite a bit, which is unfortunate. Like, I don't feel like they're super unique compared to previous companions. Like, there are some memorable companions in the Mass Effect universe, and I feel like a lot of people have their favorites, but I feel like a lot of people won't have their favorites from this game. As usual, the human characters are pretty bland and forgettable. Like, Liam and Cora are very stereotypical, and the Krogan of the game, Drax, is a Krogan. He's a bit different because he's an old guy, but that's about all that makes him unique. They had the opportunity to do something different here with a new setting for the franchise, and I feel like they didn't really do enough to mix up what a lot of the companions are and who they are. Their companion stories were decent, with some of them being a lot better than others. Liam's was not really that great and that interesting. Same with Drax, but I did like Jarl and PBs. They were quite interesting to me. I did find them to be quite engaging as characters. They don't really get huge payoffs like in previous games, but I will say the banter between them all is great. There is so much recorded dialogue between companions that I found myself just like pairing up different companions just to see what they'd say to each other out in the open world and listen to their conversations. As for the new alien species of this game, which is Jarl's race, I am not really a huge fan of them visually. Their story is interesting as a species. I just found the way they look was not really unique enough. I found them a bit generic. Like, I wish they could have been a bit more unique and stand out a bit more. Like, other aliens in the franchise have such unique designs, and these guys just felt like vaguely humanoid aliens. But that being said, Jarl himself as a character is actually a pretty good character. One of the biggest disappointments I had in this game returning to it is that I forgot that I couldn't pick companion loadouts. It was such a bummer in this game not being able to choose their armor and weapons so I could really specialize them. They have a skill tree that you can upgrade, but by the end of the game, I had all of their skill trees maxed out, so there wasn't a lot of like variety there. Like, if I wanted to play the game through a second time, they would end up the exact same way in that playthrough as I had in this playthrough, which is really unfortunate. I love being able to specialize and upgrade my companions in RPGs, and not being able to give them different weapons and armor was such a bummer. Overall, I would give Andromeda a 7 out of 10, and I feel like that's a fair score for the game. There's a lot of stuff the game doesn't do well, and it feels very bloated and stretched out, but there is a solid Mass Effect game in there, despite it falling back on a lot of stereotypes and not really doing enough to set itself apart from the previous games, despite having the ideal scenario to do so. Mass Effect Andromeda I played for most of this month. It dragged on so long. It was so much longer than I remembered it being. So by the time I finished Mass Effect Andromeda, I only had like a couple days left in the month, and I really wanted to just chill and play something not very stressful to just ease out the month, and so I picked Meammy Lane, which is a very cute little game about operating a street. You get to pick shops, upgrade them, and complete various challenges. It's a very cute little game with a very cute art style that I was immediately drawn into. It's also very cheap, $7 Australian, so there's not a lot of initial investment. It doesn't last very long. The game is not very long overall, but I feel like for $7 you definitely get your money's worth. It has great music, and the gameplay, while not anything super unique, is actually just really fun. It's a fun, cute little game about operating a street, operating shop vendors, upgrading them, and completing challenges. So it was perfect to finish out the month. Anyway, those are the games I played in June. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you've been playing down in the comment section below, and I will see you, beautiful people, in the next video.